I will call to order the September 14th meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group. Ms. Cook, will you call the roll, please?
Yes. Mr. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Ms. Leverins is also an at-large member and could not be with us today. Mr. Haldeman?
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Colster?
Here.
Mr. Colster represents the Jamestown District. Dr. Rose?
Here.
Dr. Rose represents the Roberts District. Ms. Null?
Here.
Ms. Null represents the Stonehouse District. Mr. Kropp?
Here.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District and is chair of the Planning Commission. Ms. Wortman?
Here.
Ms. Wortman represents the community participation team, and we have a quorum.
Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, I guess over to me, and I will call the September 14th meeting of the community participation team to order. And Ms. Rosario, will you call the roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Wortman?
Here.
Ms. Beck?
Here.
Ms. Brule?
Here.
Mr. Haldeman?
Here.
Mr. Kropp?
Here.
Ms. Leverins could not join us today. Mr. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. Hitchens? Mr. Piper? Mr. Carter? We have a quorum.
And before continuing, just a reminder, we've got an extra large group today. And so if you would use your raising the hand icon if you wish to speak, and that way it'll avoid people talking over each other, and that'll indicate if Ginny and I are paying attention that somebody wishes to say something. But thank you for that. Ms. Rosario?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Tammy Rosario, Assistant Director of Community Development, and joining me today at this meeting are several staff members from James City County who I'd like to introduce. We have Paul Holt, Director of Planning and Director of Community Development, Ellen Cook, Principal Planner, Alex Baruch, Principal Planner, Jose Ribeiro, and John Reisinger, Planning Staff. Also joining us are our partners in this comprehensive plan update, our consultants Vlad Gavrilovich from EPRPC and Leanne King from Clarion. Today we have a special opportunity to bring together the CPT and the Planning Commission Working Group in a joint meeting to hear the preliminary results of the Exploring Our Future Alternatives public engagement. We do so because the Engage 2045 process, more so than any in the past, is interlocked with the CPT's public engagement efforts informing the work of the Planning Commission Working Groups and the Planning Commission Working Groups' decisions guiding the next round of engagement planned by the CPT. So thank you for having us here, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Well, now moving into the PCWG and the CPT, we each have to go through the resolution to hold a virtual meeting. And as you all know, for a number of months now, we've been doing this. In our packet is a resolution to allow us to conduct this meeting virtually. To summarize, on April the 14th, 2020, the board readopted the Continuity of Government Ordinance, which under certain circumstances permits this committee to conduct today's meeting electronically or telephonically without a quorum of members being physically present. May I have a motion from a Planning Commission Working Group member to approve the resolution?
So moved, Barbara Null.
Thank you, Barbara. And Ms. Cook, would you mind calling the roll on that?
Yes. Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman? Mr. Haldeman?
Sorry, I was muted. Aye. That's not the last time that's going to happen.
Mr. Colster,
Aye.
Dr. Rose,
Aye.
Ms. Knoll,
Aye.
Mr. Kropp,
Aye.
and Ms. Wortman.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Although these meetings don't have a dedicated public comment period, we do encourage and allow comments from the public, either in the form of telephone messages, emails, and so on. If I could ask staff, were there any public comments received for this meeting?
No, there were not.
Okay, thank you. I'll now turn it over to Ms. Wortman.
Thank you. Before I do the resolution, you threw me there for a little bit of a turn, Rich, because I've never called roll on adoption of the resolution. So can I get some guidance from staff? Should I be doing that? Or can I just ask for agreement?
Oh, that's a good point. And for planning commission meetings, we've called the roll, but and so I reverted to that. But that's a good question, Jenny.
This is Tammy. Based upon my conversations with the county attorney's office, it's your preference. We do not need to do a roll call, so you could do a voice vote if you prefer.
Indeed, I do. Thank you very much. Okay, so on April 14th, 2020, the Board of Supervisors readopted the Continuity of Government Ordinance, which under certain circumstances permits the community participation team to conduct today's meeting by electronic or telephonic means without a quorum of members physically present. May I have a motion from a CPT member to adopt that resolution for this meeting?
Alderman moves.
Thank you. All in favor, all CPT members in favor of adopting that motion, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. And now I would like to ask staff, although we don't have a dedicated public comment period, we allow public comment to be collected through the mail, US mail, email, and phone. And I'd like to ask staff, were there any comments made in advance of this meeting?
No, there were not.
Okay, thank you very much. So back over to Rich or Tammy.
Thank you. And I'll defer to staff at this point.
Thank you. As mentioned earlier, today's joint meeting provides a special opportunity to highlight the interlocking nature of this process, whereby the efforts of one group works to advance the work of the other. The Planning Commission Working Group is shifting into a higher gear as we advance from the alternative futures phase to the affirming the direction phase. And the CPT is starting to take a deeper dive into the comments as it gets ready to summarize the engagement efforts collected thus far. We want to ensure that everyone is benefiting from hearing about the results of the engagement efforts at the earliest stage possible. We'll move through this presentation in 4 parts. I'll lead us through the CPT's planning and implementation of the most recent assembly. Leanne will walk us through the goals questionnaire results. Vlad will then walk us through the MetroQuest questionnaire results, and then I'll revisit where we are in the process. Because we have a lot of material to go through today and we want to be respectful of your time, we'll pause for feedback and questions after each part. And I'll ask that you use the raise the hand icon so that we can recognize you at that time. Next. Reflecting on our public engagement process as a whole, all of the CPT's work has been guided by its public engagement objectives: to give community members choice and access through different activities, to advance the community's understanding through educational opportunities, to solicit feedback from a diversity of residents, to respect and document opinions. Next. Additional objectives sought to inspire trust and continued interest and involvement, to articulate how public inputs have been used along the way, and to work toward engagement levels that surpassed past planning efforts. Next. The objectives were at the forefront of our minds, working through the design and outreach associated with the Assembly. Facing the challenges associated with the pandemic, the CPT embraced the virtual options available to us, while also maintaining options for those without technology. The live broadcast of the Assembly itself was on social media, but also Channel 48. We had live question and answer period through Facebook Live, but people could also phone or email questions. The online questionnaires through the Goals questionnaire and the MetroQuest platform were open for 3 weeks and could be completed through the county's website or via paper copies upon request. The Williamsburg Regional Library helped us spread information and access during their bookmobile and census stops in order to better reach and provide access to underrepresented communities. Next. Our event took place on August 10th. You can see here in our pictures that we had a wonderful welcoming set of remarks from Mr. Eisenhower, Chair of the Board of Supervisors. We had a presentation that, much like today's, involved myself, Leanne, and Vlad as we stepped through different elements. And we also had a question and answer period moderated by Alex Bruick. So I hope that everyone had a chance to participate in that, or if you weren't available to do so live, that you were able yourself to go back and review the materials and perhaps participate in the questionnaires. And so I'd just like to pause here for a minute and ask for any insights that you took away from the summit. The CPT debriefed immediately following the event and reflected on their ideas regarding the highlights and things that we might want to consider next time. But we'll pause here and give you some brief moments to add your comments to their body of work. Okay, I hope that if I have overlooked anyone raising their hands at this point that you'll speak up or someone will help me look for them. But I think we've received some very helpful comments from the CPT during those conversations, and we'll let those stand as part of the record, and certainly will be helpful for us moving forward. And if there are any that you want to provide at another time, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I'll pass the baton to Leanne and let her go through her part. Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. And you can forward 2 slides ahead. I was planning on turning my camera on, but unfortunately my computer's notifying me that it's probably best to keep it off right now to make sure I can keep a good connection. So hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Let me know if you have any problems with that. I'll run through these slides and then I will pause at the end before I hand it over to Vlad to take any questions that you all have. So I'm going to be presenting on the preliminary results from the Goals questionnaire. You might recall that this questionnaire was focused on considering the currently established goals in the adopted 2035 comprehensive plan in light of the 5 public input priorities that were developed in the first round of engagement, or as part of a result of the first round of engagement in Engage 2045. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the folks that responded to this survey and what the results of those questions were. We had 136 completed surveys. Not every single question was answered by each of those surveys. That's not uncommon. We see that quite frequently when we do these types of questionnaires. Next slide. So quick overview of the results. The response numbers that we have, those 136 questionnaires completed, they align with the responses that we saw for the scenario questions that Vlad will be presenting on here in just a moment. I believe there were 134 responses in total for that questionnaire. So those numbers are aligned. There are slightly different demographic responses between the goals questionnaire and the scenario questionnaire. They're very similar, but they're slightly different. So just wanted to recognize that. And that's not uncommon. We might get some folks responding to one questionnaire and not to another, and vice versa. When you look at the whole of all of the questions on the 9 goal questions, there was a response rate of anywhere from 55% to 83% of respondents that preferred to keep the goals written as they are in the current 2035 comprehensive plan. And we'll walk through and look at each of those individually, but there's fairly strong support for the current goals moving forward is what this tells us, with some adjustments. We have word clouds for each of the questions to identify some of the commonly listed words that were used in the open-ended responses for those respondents that chose that they would like to amend the goal. So we'll show those to you. And the CPT is working over the next, I believe they've got 2 meetings set up to be looking through all of those open-ended responses and theming those so that we have some good inputs to use in terms of how we might want to adjust the goals moving forward. Next slide. So we're going to walk through the kind of the demographic information about the respondents. First question that we asked was, how long have you lived in James City County? And you can see the results on the table and the chart listed here. One thing that I would just point out is actually 2 things. One is if you split the respondents in terms of folks that have lived in the county between 1 and 10 years and 10 years or greater, it's almost 50-50 between the respondents that picked one of those categories. That being said, we did have about 16% of folks that picked the I do not live in James City County or prefer not to answer response. So, there might be a mix of people that are maybe working in James City County but don't live in the county, or folks that just chose not to respond to that question for some reason. Next slide. When we look at the age of respondents, and you can see those responses and the percentage of that representation in comparison to census numbers, and that's particularly for people 18 and older, you'll see in that last column. What we saw was that for respondents that were 45 and older, we had a little bit more representation than we actually see in the community. And for respondents 45 and younger, it was actually a lower representation for each of those age cohorts. The one that in particular kind of stands out is the the 18 to 24 cohort, of which we didn't receive any responses, or at least they chose not to answer that they were in that age cohort. Next slide. When we look at the racial profiles of respondents, we see that there was actually a significant number of folks, about 10%, that preferred not to answer. Given that 10%, there's going to be some differentiation in terms of the percentage of folks represented and what the census representation shows us. For example, the Black or African American race representation is quite lower when compared with the overall census representation, which could to some be it could possibly be accounted for, and that I prefer not to answer, but we can't say that with any level of certainty. When you look at white or Caucasian representation, it was slightly higher than the census representation for the community, but somewhat similar. Next slide. So we look at race and ethnicity separately. That's how it's done in the U.S. Census. So we kind of follow their lead on this. And so we asked a separate question about whether or not respondents identify as Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin. And this is another one of those questions where, a significant number of people, almost 12%, preferred not to answer the question directly. And so our representation numbers here are going to, we'll have to kind of factor that in. The category of folks responding that, yes, they do identify as Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin is showing lower than the census representation. And those responding no to that question is also showing lower than the census representation. So again, accounted for in that I prefer not to answer category. Next slide. So what is your gender? We had about a little less than 50% of females and about 43% male respondents. About 7% preferred not to answer or preferred a different description. So those are very similar numbers to what we see, or somewhat similar numbers to what we see in the census representation. Again, the preferring not to answer is going to have an impact on those overall numbers. Next slide. So the final question that we asked here on the respondents is whether or not they've participated in one of the county's planning processes before. And this is quite interesting because it tells us that about 63% of the respondents hasn't participated in a county planning process before. So we picked up some new folks in this round number 2, which is great. 8.5% weren't sure; they didn't quite remember. So that's fine. They may not sure. They may not know what comes under county planning process before, and that's fine. And then we got about 29% or so. This is not their first time engaging. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the substantive questions. So as just a reminder, each of these questions is set out with the respondent being asked to consider one of the 5 public input priorities and then asking if the currently adopted goal in the plan should stay the same or be changed. And the options given to respond to that question were to either do not change the goal, it works, change the goal, and they were given a comment box to provide some description of how they would like the goal changed, no opinion, or I don't think this topic needs a goal. So those are the 4 responses. So on this first question, we asked them to consider the nature public input priority and whether or not the environmental goal in the currently adopted plan should stay the same or be changed. And what we heard was pretty strong support for keeping the goal. Almost 79% of respondents participating said that they would like to keep the goal as is. About 20% would like to change the goal and have some ideas about how to do that. And then 1 person didn't have an opinion. So we've got some pretty good guidance on this one. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the commonly used words that were used in the description of how the goal could be changed. And so these are the words that the descriptions that the CPT will be looking at in creating some themes for how this goal could be changed in the future based on this public input. Okay, we'll go to the next question. And this one looks at the community character public input priority and how the community character goal in the adopted comprehensive plan should stay the same or be changed with respect to that public input priority. And what we see here is, again, strong support to keep the goal as it is. About 76% of folks, about 3/4 of folks say, keep this as is. A little more than 1/5 of folks, 21.5%, say they would like to change the goal. And 4 folks at 3% said that they had no opinion on this one. So again, pretty strong support for keeping the goal as is, some ideas for how to revise this goal moving forward. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the kind of key words that came out of those open-ended responses that have ideas for how the goal can be changed. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This one focuses on considering the affordable housing public input priority and how the current housing goal in the adopted comprehensive plan should stay the same or be changed. So you'll see the numbers change a little bit on this one. There's not as much support as the previous two. So about 55% of respondents said that the goal should not be changed, that it works. And a little more than a third of folks said that the goal should be changed and have ideas for how to do that. And a few more folks don't have an opinion about this one. Almost 9% of folks don't have an opinion. So if we go to the next slide, you can see some of the words popping out from these open-ended responses on how to change the goal. You'll see, affordable housing, quality, lots of different words here that we're going to be sifting through to understand more what the ways they'd like to be able to change that goal. Okay, let's move to question 4. Considering the economic development public input priority, respondents were asked how they would like to address the economic development goal, stay the same or be changed. And a little more than 2/3 said that they would like to stay the same, this goal to stay the same at about 68%. And nearly a quarter of respondents, 24%, said that they would like the goal to be changed. The no opinion folks came in just around 8% on this question. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the words popping out there: tourism, jobs, businesses, paying, community economy, some of the ideas coming out from those open-ended responses. Next slide. We'll look at considering quality of life public input priority. Should the population needs goal stay the same or be changed? This one had also more than 2/3 of respondents, almost 69%, saying that they thought the goal worked and it shouldn't be changed. But a quarter of folks did think that there are some revisions that need to be made to this goal, and about 6% do not have an opinion. And if you move to the next slide, you can see some of the words popping out here. We've got activities, trails, facilities, programs, recreational, some of the kind of quality of life ideas that people have shared in how to change this goal. Okay, if we move forward to question 6. Also considering the quality of life public input priority, respondents were asked how the Parks and Recreation goal should stay the same or be changed. And this one received pretty strong support. 83% of respondents like the goal as is and are suggesting it shouldn't be changed. About 13% suggest there are ways that this goal could be adjusted and provide opportunities for doing that. And just a little under 4% didn't have an opinion on this one. So this is one with pretty strong support for keeping the goal as is. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the words from the open-ended responses. We see trails, parks, recreation, affordable facilities, healthy, some of the other ideas in those open-ended responses. Question 7 on the next slide. Again, looking at the quality of life public input priority, we asked respondents how the public facilities goal should stay the same or be changed. A little more than 80% of respondents say that it should stay the same. A little more than 12% think the goal should be changed, and about 7% had no opinion on this one. So again, fairly strong support, but with some ideas for how to adjust that goal. And if you jump to the next slide, you'll see some of the main words pumping out of this. We see services, facilities, public school on the next slide. Yeah. So moving to question 8, again, considering the quality of life public input priority, should the transportation goal stay the same or be changed? And this is an interesting one too, similar to housing. So we have a lower number of folks that want to keep the goal as is. We have a little bit, nearly 59% of respondents want to keep the goal the same. and a third of folks want to change the goal. And we have a little less than 8% that don't have an opinion here. So that's also important to consider. And if you jump to the next slide, you'll see some of those ideas. Transportation, of course, pops out. Trails, businesses, active, needs, safe are some of the kind of ideas popping out on this goal. Okay, and so last question on an existing goal is considering, again, quality of life, public input priority. Should the 2035 land use goal stay the same or be changed? We had a little more than 70% of respondents say that the goal should be maintained as is, and a little more than 20% that would like to change the goal. And then a little more than 9% with no opinion on this. If you go to the next slide, you'll see several responses here that kind of pop out in terms of those open-ended ideas for adjusting the goal. And then the last question, the next slide, is question 10. And this one was an open-ended question where we gave respondents the opportunity to introduce an idea for a new goal that could be included in the comprehensive plan. And so this is another one that the CPT will be looking at and theming to identify the potential for a new goal to go within the plan. So I'm gonna pause there, and if you want to use your raise your hand function, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. Let's see, Mr. Haldeman?
Hi, Leanne. Nice job. Thank you. How do you reconcile the large percentage of people who don't want to change any of the goals with the 4 or 5 survey results that show significant gaps in satisfaction in various areas, most particularly with affordable housing, but also with protecting rural lands and the like?
So 2 kind of responses to that question. So the first one is, it may be that the goal itself is a very good goal, but potentially when we start looking at the strategies and actions and the implementation of those, that's where we need some adjustments. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is, I think it's important to consider, obviously the number of responses that we received in this round number 2 is not as high as what we received in round number 1. We also want to be taking into account the citizen survey that was conducted last year. So the way we look at the public input, while we're kind of focusing on the responses from these particular questionnaires, we also want to be reflecting on what we learned from the previous public engagement we've been kind of building on that foundation over the course of this effort. So we don't want to dismiss the fact that, like you raised, the citizen survey identifies these gaps in satisfaction. I think that's something that we'll want to look at. The question is whether or not it's at the goal level that satisfaction is not being met, or is it more about the strategies and actions that are put in place where there's an opportunity to be addressing it?
Would that indicate that we should give less weight to this last round since it's only 136, or?
I think I'm not sure I would say less weight. I think that we should look at it as a collective. We want to look at kind of all the inputs together. We're building off of them, similar to what we did in round 1, where we were reflecting on how round 1 related to the responses from the citizen survey. We want to do that in this round as well. We want to kind of keep building off of that foundation so that we're not looking at this in isolation. I wouldn't say I would give it less weight. I think it's just, another set of inputs that are important to consider.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Rose, Dr. Rose?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for this. I'm curious, looking at the results here, where some goals were the majority by a wide margin said no changes, and then others had mixed response in terms of whether changes were needed or not. Do you have a sense of the characteristics of the goals that fell into those 2 categories and why you got such strong opinions? Certainly for the ones that we wanted to, where there were no changes, or there's a majority saying no changes versus the other ones. I'm just curious if there's sort of an overarching message to take away from those results.
That's a really good question. So, the housing and the transportation goals, I think if I'm remembering correctly, were the two where there was the least support for keeping the current goal. Not that there wasn't strong support, more than half of the respondents said to keep it, but, there was less support when comparing to the other questions. So I think, part of this may be that those are topics that are kind of on the forefront of people's minds potentially, that those are really kind of critical conditions that people want to see addressed one way or the other. I think it will be really helpful to, I think we'll probably be able to respond to this your question a little bit better once we get through the theming of the open-ended responses, because that's what's going to tell us what people are wanting to adjust on these goals. Just kind of preliminarily, that's my response. Those are probably the big issues, on the minds of people.
Yeah, my next question was, do you have a sense of if you take affordable housing, and they say they want to change the goal, does it mean more affordable housing or less affordable housing, less interest?
Right. And I think not to avoid your question, but I think part of that is going to be answered through that theming. So at this point, we don't necessarily I don't have a response for you on that one, but that's a really good question. The other thing I would say is it's typical in a planning process to folks tend to want to talk about the specific actions and things that are going to be done on the ground in kind of a tangible way. And so I'm wondering if some of the responses that we're going to get aren't more implementation focused as opposed to goal focused, but we'll see how that theming plays out.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Wortman?
Thank you, Leanne. A couple points I was thinking about. One is, it would be really interesting to see if people who made comments in the what's missing category are also people who said that the goals didn't need to be changed. And I'm wondering if you can do a crosstab on that, because most of the comments in question 10, the what's missing, relate directly to one or more of the goals, at least as far as I've been able to examine the answers, the suggestions to that.
So I want to make sure. Oh, go ahead.
I think it would be telling to the points that Dr. Rose and Mr. Halderman were making, to find out if the people who said don't change the goal later on made a comment that would suggest that they really weren't satisfied with the goal.
Mm-hmm. So it's possible they were using this final question, idea for new goal, to kind of share their thoughts about a goal that they didn't care for or wanted to adjust.
Right.
Okay.
And then the second question that I guess I'm looking for input from the Planning Commission Working Group also is, if you normalize the responses on whether a goal needs to be changed or not, between the it's okay as it is and change the goal, if you normalize those to 100%, would there be a threshold below which the Planning Commission Working Group would say, hey, we don't want to change that goal? Or should the CPT be looking at, regardless of the percentage of responses that wanted to change it, should we be looking at all of those responses and coming up with suggestions?
Very good question. So I think, and this kind of goes to the question that Dr. Rose posed a moment ago about thinking about the full collective of all of the engagement that we're looking at. So Granted, we didn't ask the specific question in previous, in the citizen survey or in the round one engagement. We didn't ask if people wanted to change the goals, but there are some ideas and themes that came and priorities that came out of that should be considered as part of this as well, in addition to the specific responses that we heard in this round of engagement. So that's a really interesting idea. So we can definitely normalize those responses so we can see, what the percentage between, if we just look at folks that want to keep it the same or make adjustments, how does that break down on a, scale of 0 to 100? And then, that could potentially be helpful in thinking about how big of a change that you want to make. But again, I still would advise to consider the feedback that was received in round one and the citizen survey as part of that collective body of understanding as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. And Mr. Polster?
I just took myself off mute and lowered my hand. I'd offer another approach to this, and I struggled with this with the first survey. And when you go back and you take a look at the Appendix E and look at those 3 questions, and you try to apply a wordle to it in the same way that you've done here, the frequency of a word that appears is interesting. But going back and looking at the context of the use of that word is a lot more meaningful than I think just the word itself. Right. And so if you're trying to figure out to any of these questions that are being asked, not having a context of why they use that word or why it was chosen isn't very helpful for me. Yeah. And so when you go back and you take a look at the question over the next 20 years, what are the most important land use and activities that should occur in a rural land area? And you look at that, the replies are more than just the rural. And the same thing is true for the other 2. And so the theme of parks, the connectivity, those sort of quality of life things that I think that Dr. Rose is trying to get at, the overall connectivity, comes out in the context of those statements that are made. And so just as an example on that first one that was in the survey, there were the highest use of the word was the word development. And there were 175 comments. And those comments went from slow, limit, control, curb, control, some of the development, send the guys back to the north, prohibit, eliminate, those sorts of words. And so when I look at that word now, I have a context, and I also have a way to be able to look from one survey to the other to see what the thread and the theme and the context is. So when you all come back the next time, I really want to see the full text of those comments to be able to have that context, to be able to link back to the other surveys. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Polster. I really appreciate what you just shared. And I hope, and we can, I think there's not a problem at all sharing the full content. The other piece is that the community participation team is going to be working over a series of, I believe, 2 meetings to actually work in small groups and look at all of the open-ended responses provided by the respondents and create themes from those. So they're going to spend some time and kind of reflecting as groups to make sure everybody kind of sees eye to eye in terms of the themes coming out of this. So there will definitely be some, processing, if you will, of all of the content that people have taken the time to provide that answered these questionnaires, and for us to kind of take that and glean from it the really critical ideas and themes that are coming from these responses. And that can be shared with you in the future. I think that that captures all of the raised hands. So if there are no more questions, then I will hand it back over to Vlad.
Thank you, Leanne. Good afternoon, all. Vlad Gavrilovic, Principal of EPR. I'm going to talk briefly about the results from the MetroQuest Alternative Future Survey. And as you recall, this was up for 3 weeks. This had the kind of different panels of maps and images and numbers. But this is the first opportunity the public has really had to look at the kind of future alternatives, the results of our scenario planning and scenario testing, and weigh in on it. And I'll share the kind of results and the folks that responded, but I just wanted to note that we thought this was a very good response rate. This was a robust survey that took a lot of time compared to a lot of surveys for people to respond to. This was not scenario planning light. Folks had to really study maps and images and charts and results, probably 25, 30 minutes to respond to the survey, even without adding the tell us why. So, and as you'll see, there was a lot of kind of additional comments, narrative comments on the tell us why. So we got a lot of good response. Next slide, I'll show you kind of how many people responded. But basically 134 folks completed the survey versus 586 total visitors to the site that might have just been looking or didn't hit submit and complete the survey. Again, I think 134 is a pretty good result for a survey that is this in-depth. The next slide, we'll look at the demographic responses. And this is the same 6 questions, if you recall, that we've asked in all the surveys. So in the goal survey in this round and also in the last round of surveys, so we can kind of cross-tabulate how the responses are demographically. How long have you lived here, your age, race, ethnicity, Hispanic origin, gender, and prior county planning processes. Next slide. And these are slightly different format. They're donut charts rather than bar charts, but they have the same comparison to the U.S. Census results, slightly different order than what Leanne presented too. On gender, you can see that we had the option of prefer another description of prefer not to answer, which the census doesn't, but it aligns pretty close to the census, 51% female, 40% male. Next slide. Age, pretty good distribution, honestly. There were no responses on the below 25, similar to the goals questionnaire. But we can see that there's not too much overrepresentation either among the younger cohort here, 25 to 34, at 12%, or the older cohort, 65 and older, 29%. So pretty good distribution and similar to census. Next slide. Race ethnicity. You look at the white Caucasian alone was 81%, which compares with the tracks with the census. And then, of course, we had the prefer not to answer option. The Black African American alone was only 5% compared to 13.1% on the census. But we don't know how many folks are fit in that prefer not to answer and could go in either category. Next slide. Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin, 94% of the census are not of that origin, and our survey had 84%. But again, a significant proportion, 15%, did a prefer not to answer on that. So hard to make a direct comparison. Next slide. And then finally, second last, I think, how long have you lived in the county? A good distribution, kind of evenly split among the different tenures of living in James City County. About 14% do not live in the county or prefer not to answer, and only 2% less than 1 year. Next slide. And participate in prior county planning process, very similar to the goals survey. Captured a lot of new people. 62% had not participated and 28% had. Next slide. Okay, so now to the results. So as you recall, folks were asked to rate these scenarios on 1 to 5 stars, 1 star being furthest from their vision for the county. and 5 stars being closest to their vision for the county. And then they also had the tell us why options on the maps and the images panels. Next slide. So this is the results for the maps, how people rated it. And as you recall, they had these 2 maps to look at, scenario A and scenario B, with kind of colored dots for where the potential future development could go under these 2 kind of different scenario narratives. And you can see this kind of U-shaped chart that a lot of these will have. So the scenario A, which was the trend, had a preponderance of people that gave it 1 star, so it was furthest from their vision of the county. And scenario B, the alternative, had overwhelming kind of majority of people that gave it 5 stars, closest to their vision of the county. And you can see the in-between kind of 2, 3, 4 star ratings. This is just the rating, and they did have the tell us why option. So we got a lot of results on that. Next slide, kind of share some of those with you. And the next slide you'll see has kind of a word cloud, which focuses a lot of these issues on issues of rural character, growth, traffic, impacts, things like that. And then what we did was just share some of just a smattering of the actual verbal responses. And these were just picked out a few that match the preferred scenario. Not to say that these were the only responses or that people only responded for scenario B. There were opinions expressed that preferred scenario A too, but obviously they were much more favoring scenario B, corresponding to the ratings. And things like following the current trend will undermine the goals of protecting the county's rural character, environment, and quality of life. Scenario A does not support the goals for 2045. I prefer to maintain rural areas and avoid development. Prefer higher density residential and commercial. Interestingly enough, that was for scenario B. And I like the development of small neighborhoods, villages that allow for alternative travel and a strong sense of community, but I am concerned about what is meant by attached and multifamily. So a little bit of nuance there on preferring scenario B, but some concerns about these attached multifamily place types. Next slide. So those are the responses on maps. And then on images, this is a composite of the responses on each of the 5 themes. On the left is scenario A, and the right is scenario B. And you can see a real kind of concurrence of responses here, that scenario A received the highest number of 1-star ratings for all 5 of the themes, and scenario B, the highest number of 5-star ratings for all 5 of the themes. And if you look at what kind of stands out as the highest kind of contrast, nature and environment and quality of life themes received the highest number of 1-star ratings for scenario A and the highest number of 5-star ratings for scenario B. So those 2 themes probably stood out as the biggest contrast between scenario A and B in the responses. Next slide. And then this images section also had a tell us why. And we did kind of a word cloud and summary of those. A lot of the words responded on themes of community character, keeping open space, low density, keeping natural areas. Some of the responses, again, only looking at the favorite scenario responses, I would heavily prefer little to no additional single-family housing, especially at the cost of natural spaces. Next one, scenario B, maintains the character of James City County without housing sprawl. Affordable housing should be part of residential neighborhoods with restaurants, offices, and retail businesses. That was on the affordable housing one. And there's so much of this type of development already, and it's ugly, referring to scenario A. Fill up what is empty first. And finally, expansion of walking and biking trails is a high priority. So those are just some samples of responses on the 5 themes, but obviously there was a lot more. Next slide. And then the final set of responses is on the numbers, the charts. You can see here very similar kind of scenario A getting the most 1-star, scenario B getting the most 5-star. But if you pick out what has the highest contrast, I guess, in the ratings, it's nature and environment and economic development. Highest 1-star ratings for scenario A and highest 5-star ratings for scenario B. So this did not have the tell us why component. This was just, there was plenty of opportunity for people to tell us why in the prior 2 panels. And we've got a good range of comments to comb through that kind of give a lot more detail to why people preferred scenario B over scenario A and what the elements that they particularly liked or didn't like were. So that's kind of a quick tour of our responses. And before I turn it back to Tammy to kind of go through the closeout and next steps, I wanted to see if we had any raised hands for comments on this. Yeah, we got some. So, Mr. Poster.
Let me take myself off mute. I'm trying to understand those the numbers charts and the maps chart and the other piece. On the axis on the left-hand side, that's the number of responses for each of those 1 through 5 things that were rated. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't mean to be picky, but the 134 folks that completed the survey relative to the first survey that out of 1,060, or even the second survey, where I think we had something like 400 or 500, was fantastic, and the responses and everything in there really kind of said something to me. But when I looked at these 3 for the number of folks that actually answered the question of the 134 was something very much less. And so for the maps, I think for the A side of it was 87% of that population and 67% for the scenario B. And it goes down through there. So there were much less folks, and why they did that, I don't know. I have an opinion that I picked up from a person that did take the survey, and especially with the maps, they didn't understand it, couldn't see it, couldn't make any sense of it. And that may be the reason that you got that kind of a response for the maps, or maybe even some of the other ones for it. Any comment on that?
That's a good question. And that's something we're going to have to look into, because it was my understanding that you had to complete the survey and hit submit for you to be counted here. So I don't know why you have fewer than 134 responses on these. But it's possible that you could complete it partially and hit submit and it'd still be counted. But I will check with the Michael Baker folks on how MetroQuest allows that and get back to you. And yeah, there's I definitely hear your point, and heard some other folks say too that this was not an easy survey, and that you really had to do some studying of the results to form an intelligent response. Good point.
Just the point of view, the numbers, 1 out of the 134 for the A piece, there was 60%, and for the B, 63, and that's almost a little over half of that. So that's just a concern of my part. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Haldeman.
Hi. My interpretation of these 3, the maps, images, and numbers charts, is that it's another manifestation of the satisfaction gap that we saw in the survey taken over a year ago. If you look at, scenario A is just a continuation of business as usual, and we have a high percentage of 1 stars. on some very important issues. Affordable housing is an important issue to county residents. The nature environment is important. Economic and development all got important ratings from the survey. And here we see high levels of 1 star on scenario A and high levels of 5 star on scenario B. So and this is a very small number of county residents, but added on to the survey, county residents are saying they want change. It seems to me. Well, first of all, question number 1: did I read that correctly? Am I right about that?
Yeah. Your question was, is this showing kind of the same, or is it showing a trend that everyone
a satisfaction gap? A satisfaction gap that if scenario B is something different and people prefer it, then the people prefer it to scenario A, which is business as usual, then they're telling you that they want change, and they must want change because they're not satisfied with the status quo.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I would agree with that, if you take the scenario A as doing what we've been, dissatisfaction with what's happening right now and the trends we've got now and a desire to change it.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, was there a part 2 to your question?
There was, and I can't remember it. I'm sorry. but that's really what I wanted to know, if I was interpreting that correctly. Yeah. Thank you.
Ms. Wertman.
Jack, you just made me laugh so hard that I think I forgot part of my question.
Jenny, when you get to be as old as I am, you'll understand. So
I forgot it too.
I guess 2 things. First, or maybe 3. Jack, I like that interpretation. I think maybe you've hit on something there, because what I was noticing was that there seemed to be different total numbers of people who responded to the scenario A versus the scenario B pieces of each question. And I wondered what, if anything, to read into that. So if I'm making up these numbers, if 120 people voted scenario A for affordable housing and only 95 people voted on scenario B for affordable housing, do we need to read anything into that, or except that they got tired, or was there some sort of confusion? And then the addendum to that question is, was there any place where people could express their opinion about how they found the MetroQuest survey? Did they get an opportunity to say, this was great, or, oh boy, I got confused, or, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the answer to that. So that's my question.
Yeah. Yes. Let me answer your second question first. We tried to get an extra question in the last panel, but unfortunately MetroQuest had a limit to those 6 questions that we had all, in the prior version. I guess the only opportunity people had, and some people did say some comments about this, was in the Tell Us Why, which was totally open-ended. They could just talk about whatever they wanted. And some people did comment on things that they might have found confusing or had questions about in, for example, the maps. But your first question too about are we to read anything into the fact that some questions got more respondents than others? I don't know. Obviously, it could be the complexity of the question or just whether they preferred answering it or not. I think if this had been the type of survey where you had to answer every single one before it was counted, we probably would have gotten less responses. But I think, to me, the most important thing is to take this, as Leanne says, the totality of input that we've gotten to date, and is there any vehicle for input that shows markedly different results, or are they all consistently saying similar messages? Because different ones might have different audiences, people that are more survey oriented or visually oriented for the images versus the numbers. But if we're seeing the same pattern of responses and the same kind of themes cropping up, I think that's a significant finding.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Polster. Or is your hand still raised? I'm not sure if you raised it again.
No, I'm sorry, I was on mute. I was struggling there. I just wanted to make a comment on what Jenny said and Jack said. I absolutely agree about the satisfaction piece. And to Jenny's point, without even making numbers up, the responses for affordable housing and for community for both A and B were 81 and 81, which tells me that at least the same 81 folks answered those questions. And to your point, they'd rather see something done about those two areas because they're unsatisfied with it. And that's my interpretation when I start to look at these numbers in terms of who answered it when and to what degree. So even though it's not the full 134, it's consistent in terms of the view of what these slides are supposed to say.
Good point. And we wanted to show the results, not just percentages, but kind of be clear about how many people responded to each one. But okay, well, if there are no other questions, oh, sorry.
I was having trouble with the raise my hand feature. This is Becca Brule. I think just the other thing, just having read through some of the open-ended responses from the other portion that we discussed earlier, there does seem to be some, sounds like very kind of similar themes in terms of affordable housing and quality of life. And so it looked like the numbers were pretty similar, although there were some demographic differences between, the groups that responded to both sections of MetroQuest versus the goals and priorities. And so I guess I just want to say it seemed like it might be kind of a similar group of people that responded to both, and the responses kind of do seem to align somewhat in terms of kind of the open-ended stuff. And so I assume that you will kind of take those together. The CPT is just looking at the open responses to the other component. Do we also need to be looking at the MetroQuest responses?
Good question. Yeah, I think we need to share all of these. Certainly nothing is hidden here. And then, I think it would be useful to at least, I don't know if it's part of the theming, because the theming exercise is specifically for the goals, but it certainly would be useful to have CPT members look at these and see how the open-ended responses conform to what you're seeing in the scenario ratings, and maybe even what you're hearing in the goals open-ended responses too. And Leanne or Tammy or others may want to add to that, but I think we do need to share those out, the full spreadsheet of all the responses.
Right. The only thing I was just going to share, Vlad, is to your point, I think the theming should focus on what the open-ended responses are to those specific questions. But when we prepare the overall report, similar to what we did in round one, where we identified the 5 input themes, that's we'll do a similar type thing with this round 2, where we'll be able to look at the whole collection of inputs, both for round 2 and for kind of the broader collection since the citizen survey to date, and be able to look at some of those kind of cross-cutting, issues that keep coming up, whether it be this survey or the goals survey or the citizen survey. I think that report's our opportunity to kind of tie all those pieces together.
Exactly. Mr. Kropp.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to check in with the staff and the consultants. I know we started a few minutes beyond our 4 o'clock time today, but and I don't want to stifle discussion, but I just want to check on time and see where we're going at this point. if there's no other questions, I guess we can move through the agenda, because I know the CPT is going to adjourn. But at any rate, I just wanted to make sure that we were still okay time-wise.
Thank you. I think we do have a few more slides, but that should bring us pretty close to our targeted time, and I could just proceed if there aren't any other questions. We could also pick them back up at the end. Okay. Well, I'll just, in this closing set of slides, just bring us back to what these results mean in terms of the overall picture. Looking back, we can see one of the public input objectives of the CPT was for us to have an effort that surpassed past comprehensive plan efforts. And so when we look at past numbers, we have a very comparable level of engagement with the citizen survey. That is, we reached levels that showed us that we were really getting a representative sample of the county. Even more so in this compared to previous citizen surveys, a better response rate and demographic reach. In terms of the numbers of participants in these rounds of engagement where we've had the assemblies and the summit, there too we are comparing favorably to past efforts. We have a major effort back in 2008, 2009, in which we were able to engage 149 people outside of the citizen survey. And for a smaller effort, more targeted effort in 2014, we had 77. We surpassed both of those numbers with our first out of the gate effort in November, where we had 440 participants, but we're basically building upon that. And so with these additional 135 participants, we have 575 thus far, which is really exciting in terms of meeting that CPT objective, but also, as Vlad and Leanne shared, kind of engaging some new citizens in the process. From those exit surveys, we can see that we've reached people who haven't really participated in the past. Next. There were some other public engagement objectives as well that are very important to pay attention to. And I think you can see through tonight's effort, as well as what we still have ahead of us in terms of theming the open-ended responses and preparing a public engagement summary report, that we are going to be working collectively to show that we are respecting opinions of citizens, we are documenting them, we are through these meetings using them to help inform policy direction. And through those particular activities, we do seek still and hope that we are reaching levels where we inspire trust and continued interest and involvement in the process. Finally, like I said, that final report for this phase will look back across other phases, and we still have another round of engagement ahead of us, and it too will tie all these different inputs together. And so this is hitting on this very last objective of clear documentation of the activities to articulate how all of it has been used throughout the process. Next slide. So what does this really mean for the CPT and the Planning Commission Working Group in terms of your work ahead and to the overall process? I think bottom line, it means that we're going to be very busy. And certainly I know the CPT has received a lot of material because we are going to be diving into those open-ended responses from the goals questionnaire in terms of our theming exercises. That will be an element that we'll pass along to the planning team and will be folded into the public engagement summary. But along the way, we will be passing along that information to the Planning Commission Working Group, because the Planning Commission Working Group is jumping into the technical review wholeheartedly, shifting into a higher gear, as I said earlier. We have work ahead of us as far as going through the preferred scenario, talking about what that means in terms of some preliminary policy and land use recommendations. And as we have this evening, some closer review of particular chapters, starting with population. So it's important that the Planning Commission Working Group yield that public engagement information from the CPT along the way in order to inform its decisions. All culminating in a Board of Supervisors work session with PC representation at the end of October, where they will receive this public engagement report and hear what the reviews and decisions of the Planning Commission Working Group have yielded up to this point in terms of all those different elements that I talked about, and some insight, a glimpse at the land use applications. We want to check in with the Board of Supervisors and make sure that we are keeping them abreast of all of this great work and that they are able to guide us as we move forward. So very significant work ahead of us, very exciting things. We still, as we talked about, are at the tip of the iceberg in terms of details that we need to work through to make this comprehensive plan updated in its entirety. We are at the goal level right now, and we will be working through that and going down deeper and deeper into more specific policies and ultimately actions that we might be taking, and then going back out to the public. So with that, I just want to pause once again to hear from you any feedback, to ask if there's any questions related to these different presentation elements, the assembly and the results, how they relate to the process, wanting to check in if you're clear on the steps for moving forward, or just any other comments that you might have at this point. I see that there is a hand up with Ms. Beck.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say thanks for letting us participate in this combined meeting and appreciate the awareness that there's a lot of work coming ahead for the CPT with the theming exercises. There's a lot of open-ended comments to come through. And summarize, as I look at some of them, you know, another one of our goals, Tammy and team, was really to raise awareness and engagement levels through education. And I'm noting a lot of open-ended comments from the community asking for more information and more education. So I just wanted to throw that out to the CPT is just as we theme these over the next couple of days, it'll be important to kind of note where our community needs more information and making sure that we don't lose sight of our need to continue educating, in addition to pulling together common themes and giving feedback back to the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors on this. So more of a comment than a question. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. That's really helpful as we move into those next meetings with the CPT. I see that Mr. Haldeman has his hand raised as well.
Just a brief response. And I certainly want to do everything we can to answer community questions and so forth. But I've always been, since moving here 16 years ago, so impressed with the transparency of county government. Not just in this process, but government in general, the television and the printed materials and so forth that are accessible to residents on a wide range of subjects. And this process in particular has been as exhaustive as I can imagine anybody making it. starting a year and 1 month ago, I guess, or even before that, if you count the survey, we've had 3 engagements, and the whole time open email and telephone access. There have been any number of advertisements, podcasts, radio interviews. I really, and I would welcome anybody else who wants to make a comment at this point is more than welcome to do so. But I really feel like we've done a good job with with this in terms of reaching out, and there may be some people out there who weren't aware this process was going on, but it's hard for me to imagine that's the case.
Thank you, Mr. Haldeman. I see perhaps that Ms. Beck has her hand raised again, or I don't know if that was from earlier.
No, it was actually, and I hope I didn't, Mr. Haldeman, I did not mean to imply that it has not been a well communicated. Okay.
I didn't take it that way. No.
Okay. All right. I agree. No, I agree with you. I just want to make sure we're keeping track of opportunities to continue educating and raising awareness in areas where survey respondents aren't clear on what a goal means or an opportunity for the community. So thank you.
One thing I'll mention, and Leanne and Vlad can certainly jump in as well, is that the CPT will, much as we have done with rounds 1 and 2, be having a strong hand in how we design the third round of engagement. So those are different thoughts that we can keep in mind as we decide how we want to fashion that third round of engagement. I'll just do one last check and see if there are any comments or questions for individuals that I didn't recognize. Mr. Haldeman, was your
oh, I'm sorry. No, no, I'm done. Sorry.
Okay. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Koff.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rosario. And I just want to, before recessing, I just want to thank the planning team, the consultants for the presentation today. This was very, very helpful. It sifted through a lot of data, and as we could see from the comments of the team members, this has opened up some new avenues to pursue. So thank you very much for all the hard work that went into today's presentation. And on that note, we'll recess the Planning Commission Working Group for 5 minutes. So it's a little after 5:30. We'll come back together, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Wertman.
When we will start doing our deep dive into the goals questionnaire open-ended responses. May I have a motion?
This is Rich, so moved.
Thank you very much. All in favor of adjourning the CPT meeting until September 17th, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
Next item on the agenda is we have 3 sets of minutes, and I'll ask the staff, can we work this as a group, or do you want me to take each set of minutes separately?
I think as a group would be fine.
Okay. In that case, we have the minutes from April 6th, May 6th, and July 13th of 2020. First of all, were there any corrections or changes for the minutes? And if so, just identify the set of minutes you're referring to. Okay. Hearing none, may I have a motion to approve all 3 sets of minutes?
So moved, Barbara.
Thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. We now move into the discussion of the upcoming process, and I'll turn it over to the planning team. The consultant team, I guess I should say.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. This is Vlad Gavrilovic again. I am waiting for the slide. There it is. Good. I just wanted to update you all on the next meeting and kind of what's ahead, and look forward to your discussion and guidance on any of that. So go ahead with the next slide. And go ahead to the next slide. This is really a discussion of the schedule through the end of the year, and specifically focusing on your next meeting in 2 weeks. So this is kind of what you saw in the last meeting, but a little bit expanded to go up through the end of the year. And this is a summary of the Planning Commission Working Group meetings, the Board Planning Commission Joint Meeting, and the CPT meetings. And one thing I want to highlight, well, 3 things with the blue arrows there, but starting in the middle. So that is a key pivot point in the process, this October 27th joint meeting between the Board and Planning Commission. What we want to try and get in front of the Board and Planning Commission, really make sure that they're okay with, is the summary of public input to date, kind of what we've been talking about in the last joint meeting, an idea of the preferred scenario based on the public input, and then extending that into very preliminary policy and land use. I would almost call those considerations rather than recommendations. In addition, the kind of first look at the land use applications. But that is a lot in that meeting, but it really is to really, because there's so few kind of board check-ins, they're kind of quarterly, to get their blessing or their kind of okay on where this process is at this point. Here's what we've heard. Here's what we've heard leads into a preferred scenario, and here's some of the implications potentially for policy and land use of that. And if you back up to from that date of October 27th, there's 3 Planning Commission Working Group meetings before that. And the very next one on September 28th, that's your first blue arrow there, is to present to you that preferred scenario framework and the preliminary policy and land use framework. There's also going to be some chapter reviews as time permits. But that is basically to get a first look at that from you all, and then a second look at that on October 5th, because the packet for the board meeting is due on October 7th. So really you guys get kind of 2 bites at that apple before the packet goes into the board, and then you will be looking at it jointly with the board on October 27th. And that, as I said, is kind of a key pivot point also, because going forward from that, you notice the third blue arrow is the third round of public engagement, which we're projecting to be on December 14th. In all likelihood, that will still be a online type of engagement because of the public health crisis. We'll see at that point, not sure. But either way, trying to get that to stay on track with the overall schedule to occur before the holidays there. And in order to kind of make that work, there's 3 Planning Commission working group meetings between the board meeting on October 27th and that public engagement in December, including the middle one of that is to look at the draft future land use map. That's the FLUM there. So the goal here really is to get board and planning commission kind of blessing on the way the policy is heading and the land use is heading, turn that into a draft future land use map for your review on November 23rd, and get that in front of the public on December 14th. So that's the big picture on schedule. And then next slide. So therefore, the next Planning Commission Working Group meeting will look at those 2 big elements, the preferred scenario framework, the preliminary policy and land use framework, and initial kind of chapter reviews. Next slide. And what to expect on that preferred scenario, why these items. As I said, these are key items to get in front of the board and the Planning Commission on October 27th. And you get 2 views of these before that, the Planning Commission Working Group on the 2 meetings before that. Next slide. So where these fit in the overall process, you've seen this diagram before, but as you recall, the results from the scenarios that go into the public review and input that we've just had are used to build a refined goals and policies framework, which is then used to build the future land use map and the elements of the comprehensive plan and implementation. So really how the public review and input gets turned into that refined goals and policies framework is these 2 blue boxes on the bottom, which is the preferred scenario, which leads into implications for policy and land use framework, kind of considerations for that. That's just to show kind of the flow of decisions as we get down to a future land use map. Next slide. Should point out that that also has a, when we have that preferred future land use map, that will leave, that will be turned into a preferred, a leave behind model, which will have that preferred scenario built into the modeling and be used for ongoing planning by the county. So for the next meeting, what to expect, this preferred scenario, which you'll get in about a week, it will have these kind of 3 elements to describe the preferred scenario: words, map, and images. The words portion will be the key takeaways from the public input, organized according to the 5 public input themes, and how each one of them has implications for policy development. You know, what those takeaways mean in terms of nature and environment, affordable housing, economic development, things like that. Then there will be a map, a conceptual land use map, which will use kind of colors and diagrams to describe potential future land uses. Very conceptual at this point, but ideally to get some kind of understanding of that to be able to turn that into future land use frameworks in the coming months. And then finally, some images and descriptions of additional planning concepts that build on these policy themes that we've heard. So things like additional concepts on affordable housing or on mixed use and how those play out in terms of state of the practice planning concepts. Next slide. And then the other part will be this preliminary policy and land use framework. And this will be primarily words, but it's taking what the preferred scenario says and turning it into policies, really. So initial takeaways from the planning team that we've kind of distilled from the input, and that is, of course, refined by the CPT through their theming exercises. So those really, there's 2 more CPT meetings on the theming, and that will go into that preliminary land use framework. And to anticipate a question you might have, So how are we presenting this to you in 2 weeks when we have not completed the theming exercises by the CPT? And the answer is, it'll just be the initial kind of planning team input and what we have to date from the CPT, and it will be provisional. It will be finalized when we have the final CPT input on those themes. And then the policy implications will be a narrative on the overall policy implications derived from the public input and the scenarios. And we'll also propose some draft refinement to the vision and the goals framework. Again, these will not be finalized until we have the input from the CPT theming exercise, though. Next slide. So that's kind of a brief run through of what to expect in your meeting in 2 weeks and in your packet in about a week. As Tammy said, there's a lot to be reviewed in the coming weeks, and that's to keep us on track so that we can start building this new comprehensive plan right after that public input that we have at the end of the year. Happy to answer any questions. Mr. Haldeman.
Hi, thank you very much. Would you please go back to slide 60, back two pages? Thank you. You say they're organized by the 5 public input themes. Have we now decided that those are the 5 public input themes, or are they still subject to change? Which is not to suggest that I want to change them, because I don't.
Yeah, that's a good question, and Leanne and Tammy may want to add to this. You know, my kind of thought on it is that those are not the goals framework. You know, those are being used to inform the goals framework. They are an organizing facet of the public input. But
right.
Yeah, I think, you know, everything that we've done to date has been organized around those. So I would say yes. Great.
Okay. The only thing we have left to do, I guess, is the theming of the comments that were made, and there were 136 responses to the survey, and a vast majority of them don't want any changes to the goals. And the open-ended responses, represent a very small percentage of the overall response that we've had dating back over a year. So I think they're interesting. I've read them all, and there are some good comments and things that we can use on the strategies and actions. But this is just my personal opinion. Other people may disagree, but there's nothing in them that will cause us to change the 5 public input themes. And I've said this before. I think the consultants and staff did a great job of distilling all this data that we have from the surveys and the public meetings and everything else into those public input themes. I think you hit it dead on, and so I'm glad that it seems like we've decided on them, and they're set, and we can go from here.
Good point. It all builds on prior efforts too. Yeah, Mr. Polster.
I think 3 things, and the first one's a question, is could you give me an example on that same slide that Jack just called for? Give me an example of implications of policy development.
Sure. So, for example, one of the things we heard in the MetroQuest survey was, and this is in the open-ended comments, limit development in the rural lands, expressed in various ways. And an implication for policy development would be, limit development in the rural lands, basically. And of course, that has various implementation options for it. But that would be a real simple example of what we heard turn that into policy.
Just to comment on that example, because that's a good one for me, at least, and it gets back to the satisfaction piece that we talked about, is there's nothing in your MapQuest surveys on the maps that even talks about that issue. I mean, it's the same for both A and B. So how would we know about, outside of the written comments, that when we come to a land use map, that's going to do anything for reducing the rural lands?
Yeah, there's no implementation, you're right, options in the MetroQuest survey, but there was a difference in the amount of development in rural lands in scenario A and B. And you could see that in the little bar charts at the bottom of the map, and also in the narrative about describing what was happening in scenario A and B. And you'll see in the open-ended comments, a fair number of people picked up on that and said, yes, this is what we want in scenario B. We want to limit development in the rural lands.
Well, I would have thought that the policy implication is a rezoning. And so the implication of a land use map is that a change would happen in the zoning pieces in the rural areas. So to me, that's an implication of a policy development that will apply to any of the things that you're suggesting. Am I right about that?
I would say that that's really a round three public engagement question. We want to ask some implementation questions. So if you want to limit development in rural lands, you could do it through voluntary incentives, through financial purchase of development rights, or you could do it through regulatory rezonings. And there's probably a bunch of others options. And that's one of the things we've been talking about, how to build those questions into a round three engagement to see people's, kind of tolerance for different implementation options to limit development in the rural land.
I think you're absolutely right. Whether it's the PDR or changing the A1 from 1 house to 3 acres to 5, which you saw in your second engagement that people wanted to see a higher degree, that's an implication that I think is important for a discussion that we have on the land use map before it goes to the board. So let me get back to the other two issues that I had. Is that I do agree with Jack and Jenny that the dissatisfaction of those areas in the theme are correlated. And so when we come to the land use map, just like I've asked about the rural area, I'm interested in a discussion in the land use map, whether it's the preferred or whatever the scenario you guys come up with, is whether or not it does anything to reduce those gaps. Now, the last time we talked about this, it's an opportunity. But that opportunity has a policy decision to it and a discussion that I'd like to see before we get to the board, which brings me to my third point, is the way the two meetings are before we get to your suspense of getting to the 7th of October to get the board package in, means that we're only going to have 2 sessions to be able to talk about this. And frankly, I've voiced this before, I want to hear from the other commissioners about these issues, because I don't think that the land use map right now answers the question on those 5 gaps of satisfaction. And that, to me, takes a little bit of a conversation amongst all of us before you send your packet in on the 7th. Thank you.
Thank you. Good points for discussion. Ms. Wertman.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in that I think a lot of these, this slide about the words, what it really means is that we need to be taking this kind of holistic view of all of the comments that have come in, not only through the goals questionnaire, but also in the comments from MetroQuest, and put them all in a big sifter and try to make certain that they're all put in the buckets. And I believe that they will all fit into those 5 theme buckets. So it's just a case of, maybe we don't change the specific wording of goal, but there are going to be a lot of input that we got from people regarding maybe the how, not as much as the what. Thank you.
Understood, yeah. And we definitely don't want to gloss over that, because as we get to implementation options, we want to go back to the input, all the input we've received that people have had on the how. So, yeah, Mr. Croft.
Yes, thanks, Vlad. To Frank's earlier point, why don't we work with staff? I'll get with Tammy and Ellen, and we'll see about the September 28th PC working group meeting, if we can at least build some time in that agenda to talk a little bit about next steps regarding the points that Frank just made. And I'm looking to staff as to whether that's a realistic idea to look at the September 28th agenda.
Certainly, we'd be glad to work with you.
Okay, thanks.
Don't see any other hands raised. And I'm not sure if I hand it back to staff or to Mr. Croft.
I'll just introduce that concludes the consultant presentation, and we're now moving into the population chapter materials, and I'll turn it over to the planning team.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. Hopefully everybody's listening to me okay. My name is Jose Ribeiro, and I work as a planner in the county's community development department. With me is my coworker, John Reisinger, also a planner, and together we'll be presenting the population section. So this is our agenda for this afternoon. Most of today's presentation is based on information that can be found in the technical report and the technical appendix. The technical report is the proposed revised chapter text of the section, while the appendix contains the majority of the raw demographic data in table and graphic forms with some limited text. Staff will then briefly present information regarding community guidance and goals, strategies, and actions. Population. As noted in the memorandum, one of the updates to this chapter is the change in name from demographics to population. The word population can be generally defined as all the inhabitants of a particular area, which seems to be a better title for this chapter, as its intent is to describe and provide information about the characteristics of the population of our community. Another update is that the chapter previously known as Population Needs has been incorporated into the population chapter, making it more comprehensive. The majority of the data used for the update came from the Census Bureau American Community Survey, ACS, 5-year estimates between 2014 and 2018. Here are some selected demographic and socioeconomic data for James City County. The county has a growing population, although growth rates have slowed down compared to population growth experienced during the 1980s and 90s and 2000. The county median age at 46.4 years old and household income at approximately $83,000 are higher than the Metropolitan Statistical Area, the MSA, and the state. James City County also has a growing aging population with a 65 and older age cohort, forecasted to represent more than 30% of the county population by 2040. Race distribution has remained relatively unchanged over the years, although the proportion of the Black African-American population has been decreasing. So here we can see growth of the county's population since 1990 and compared with adjacent localities, the MSA and the state. The county's growth rate between 1980 and 1990 represented a change of approximately 53.6%. Between 2000 and 2010, the growth rate came down to 39.3%, still higher than York County, Williamsburg, and the state, but lower than the MSA at 46%. The county's lower annual growth rate appears to be following a state trend. The 2019 population estimates for Virginia counties and cities report released by the Weldon Cooper Center shows that although the state added over 500,000 new residents since the last census in 2010, population growth has slowed down across Virginia in recent years, reaching its lowest levels since the 1920s at approximately 0.7% annually between 2010 and 2019. Despite the slower rate of growth compared to past decades, the county population continued to grow at a faster rate than the majority of the other localities in the state. As the map shows, James City County was one of the few localities in the state to have grown more than 10% between 2000 and 2019. Age. Age composition is an important element of a population. Historically, James City County has had a higher median age compared to other adjacent localities, the MSA and the state. Similar to median age, the proportion of the population 65 years and older in the county continues to be greater than surrounding localities, the MSA and the state, and has continued to increase over time. James City County has a growing population of 65 and older. This table shows the breakdown of the county's age cohorts between 1990 and 2018. Please note how the percent growth of the population under 19 has remained relatively stable over these years. The population between 20 to 64 years old has been decreasing over time, while the population of 65 and older, which represented 11.5% of the population in 1990, now represents almost 24% of the total population of the county. The growth of the 65 and older age cohort is forecasted to continue to grow, and at a faster pace than that of other age cohorts. Race. The racial composition of the county is similar to that of York County and the city of Williamsburg. However, the Hampton Roads MSA and the state have higher percentages of racial diversity. Between 1990 and 2018, the percentage of the white population has remained relatively unchanged at around 80%, while the percentage of the Black or African American population has decreased from 18.5% in 1990 to 13.2% of the population in 2018. The number of Hispanics of any race has been increasing since 1990. Average household size. A household includes all persons living in a housing unit. In James City County, the average household size has been decreasing over the last few decades. However, since the last census, it has begun to rise, and that appears to be part of a nationwide trend. This ongoing trend could be the result of more people living in multi-generational households and or more people living together due to economic reasons. The majority of households in James City County are led by married couples. Educational attainment. In terms of education, James City County has a well-educated population, with almost half of the population with a bachelor's degree or higher. Also, the number of people 25 years and over who have at least graduated from high school has been growing over the last decade in James City County and in the Hampton Roads area as well. The MSA has the highest percentage of people 25 and over with a high school diploma or higher at 95.6%, followed by James City County at 95%. Median household income. James City County has a relatively wealthy population with the median household income of approximately $83,000, higher than the median household incomes of the MSA and the state. In 2018, almost 20% of the county's households had incomes between $100,000 and $150,000, the highest income tier. and 2.3% of households had incomes between $10,000 and $15,000, the lowest income tier. The poverty rate has been decreasing over the years from 15.7% in 1990 to 7.8% in 2018. However, children under the age of 18 have the highest poverty rates in the county. John?
Thank you, and good evening to the working group. Population projection. The Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, HRPDC, and the Weldon Cooper Center have prepared population projections for the county for the years 2025, 2035, and 2045. The graphic compares these two projections along with a third population projection model known as linear projection, chosen for its fit with James City County's historical population trend. Accordingly, with the HRPDC's projection, the county population is projected to grow by approximately 63% by 2045. The Weldon Cooper Center projection puts the population growth at 58%, and staff's linear projection of growth is at 41%. Age cohort projection. Because age cohort projection information for 2025, 2035, and 2045 is not currently available, staff is using age cohort data projections from 2020, 2030, and 2040. In 2018, slightly more than half of the county's population belonged to the 20 to 64 years age cohort, followed by the 65 years and older and the less than 19 years old age cohorts. As projected by the Weldon Cooper Center, the proportion of the 20 to 64 age cohort will decrease in the years to come and represent 46% by 2040. The percentage of the population less than 19 years old will remain relatively stable over the next decades, representing almost 20% of the county's population by 2040. The population 65 years and older is projected to continue to increase and represent 34% of the population by 2040. Youth. The percentage of the youth population of James City County, less than 19 years old, has been decreasing over the years. However, it appears to be stabilizing at 20% of the population. The table shows the historic and projected growth of the youth population over the years. While more recent data would help determine current barriers to serving youth needs in a community, past information has indicated that lack of awareness was the most significant obstacle for youth in obtaining needed services. Other barriers noted were the lack of space for programs and services, lack of adequate transportation, and cost. These barriers also affect the larger considerations of childcare, recreation facilities, and community economic development. Many county departments, as well as organizations in the nonprofit sector, work to serve youth needs. Examples include the Parks and Recreation Department's Teens on Point program and the Police Department's Community Outreach program. Seniors. The senior population, ages 65 and older, is the fastest growing age cohort in the county. In 1990, there were 8,097 people aged 65 and older, representing 11.5% of the total population. In 2018, this figure increased to 17,930, or 24.2% of the population. By the year 2040, the Weldon Cooper Center projects this figure to rise to 46,581, or 34% of the population. This growth may be attributed to the natural aging of the population and people moving to James City County to retire. Some of the senior needs as identified by the county's Social Services Department includes healthcare, housing, nutrition assistance, transportation, and employment. Programs and services offered include Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, paratransit services, Project Lifesaver, and the new Community Outreach Network Educate, Care, Thrive, or CONNECT program, a partnership between social services, the police department, and the fire department. Technical Appendix. The technical appendix contains the majority of the raw demographic data in table and graphic forms. In addition to typical demographic information, the appendix also contains the at-a-glance page of graphics, demographic information for the county's 11 census tracts, information about the 2019 homelessness point-in-time count. After the 2020 census data is released, staff intends to update the technical appendix to post the updated version for the public. Next slide, please. Community guidance. The community guidance document summarizes the public input related to the population chapter that has been received to date from the citizen survey and the first round of community engagement. The slide shows some of the input received so far. A second round of community engagement is ongoing, and a third round of community engagement is tentatively planned for December 2020, January 2021. As the results of the upcoming community meetings become available, staff will update the community guidance document for review by the PCWG. It is intended that a summary of all the community guidance will be included within the chapter text for the final version. For this initial review, staff has not revised the goals, strategies, and actions that were adopted for the Toward 2035 Leading the Way comprehensive plan. Staff is currently beginning to examine potential revisions to the GSAs and has tentatively identified some actions to be potentially revised. Members of the PCWG are welcome to provide initial suggestions and comments regarding the revision of the GSAs, and to provide suggestions for questions to include in the next round of public input. At this time, we'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks very much, John and Jose, and I'll keep it with you two to select the folks that are raising their hands.
And I could jump in and call on folks and then pass it over to the team to answer questions. I see a hand from Mr. Colster.
I've got two questions, and the first one's on slide 79. Hello, there you go. No, the community.
Sorry, Mr. Colster, I don't have them numbered on my side, so I'll need to go off of a description of it. Sorry.
It's a community guidance one.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I got to tell you, I was really impressed, and I hope that I'm going to see the same thing for all the rest of the chapters. And what I was impressed about is that there was a synthesis of each of the community input sessions minus the latest one. And I think it goes back to Jack's comment and one of the CPT comments about how we're showing people how we actually got to where we are. And so that represented to me a synthesis of what was in the inputs. And so that's what motivated me to go back and look at the context of the statements that were made in the Appendix E with the 3 questions, which is what's referenced here in the population for it. So I applaud this, and I think that's a nice way to be able to tell folks as we look at each individual chapter exactly what the community had to say about that when you look at all of the input that came in. So good job. The next one is slide 74, which shows the HRTPO, the Weldon Cooper, and the linear. That's not it, Alex. There you go. That's it. So I think I understand what the HRTPO curve of 124, 70, 41, because that's what the scenario is that Vlad is working off of for the population. I'm a little confused about the red line on the Weldon Cooper, since their algorithm is what's being used in the top blue line on that. But having said that, please tell me how we came to the linear 104, 572, and then I have a comment after you tell me that.
This is John. The linear projection looks at a change in population over a period of time, specifically looking at the growth rate between 2010 and 2019 using staff's population estimates, and that's where that number comes from.
How did you get it out to 2045 if that's true?
It would be multiplying the growth rate by the number of years. And so you take from the 2015 data point and you just add 30 years to that through the formula.
Can I offer another reason for that curve?
Sure.
You have 11,000 approved lots, and you have 4,100 anticipated, for a total of 15,279, of which you project that over this time frame over the next 38 years out of the last land use graph. When you compute that number of 15,279, it represents, with 2.53 per household, which is high, 80% of that 120,741 that the HRTPO. And if that's true, you already have 80% of the capacity of what this county needs for growth to accommodate the population by 2045 by any of those three estimates. Therefore, why do we need more mixed use and some of the other land use issues that are being proposed? So I'd like a more definitive answer about that 104, 572 relative to the growth rate in the primary service area that you have projected in your 2035 comp plan. And I know the staff is working on the next version of that, but that tells me more about what our population needs are than what I've heard so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Polster. I know we're running a little long here, and at the moment I only see one more hand raised. It's Dr. Rose.
Yeah, a couple questions. One, are these population projections, will they change with the 2020 census once those data come out? And the follow-up question is, it seems like what potentially drives changes in population is the sort of the characteristics of the county. And if part of this planning process reevaluates those characteristics of the county, does it change the population estimates?
Dr. Rose, this is Jose. So to answer your first question, I think it's possible once the 2020, or very likely once the 2020 population number comes in, and if that's that information is plugged into the formula, that it may change the projection a little bit, or maybe more than just a little bit. But I think so. I think that likely will change. And as far as your second question, would you mind asking that again?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to understand how the population estimates are just an extension of the growth that's happened already. And the growth happens because of the characteristics of James City County. like you said, we have a growth in older populations because it's a place people see as a retirement location. But as the planning process goes on and maybe some changes go into effect that change the characteristics, do those end up getting revised? Like, do you maybe see more growth in younger populations because you're planning for more amenities that would attract a younger population?
Yeah, so I think that, once if the characteristics that make James City County the place that it is changes over time, so likely it's possible that there will be a change in age cohort, where maybe you will become more attractive, for families to raise kids here, or it may be less attractive to senior residents. Yeah, it's kind of a chicken and an egg, maybe, because certainly, if characteristics change, I think that could reflect into population projections.
Yeah, I guess the question, maybe it's a more of a philosophical question. As part of this planning process, are you planning for the county that you have now, or are you planning for the county as you want it to be in the future? And I guess it's a broader question, not needing of an answer. It's just something that has crossed my mind here.
Thank you, sir.
This is Tammy. If I could just add in one other consideration, is that the population forecasts, at least through HRPDC, also try to take into account our land use policies and our land use map. And so they do a top-down, bottom-up. That is, they look at the region as a whole and what the population forecast might be for the region, and then they break it down into different localities and test that assumption for each locality based against its comprehensive plan, what the land use map says, what the relative outlook is for that locality. So there is some insight there that perhaps what we do in this comprehensive plan will further have an impact on the population forecast, other than just what our historical projections have been, or our attractiveness of the county relative to others, or even there are national forces at work as well.
Excuse me, Bob, there's nothing philosophical about the algorithm that's used by the HRTPO or the Weldon Cooper. That algorithm consists of by right, which is the 15,279, driver's license, and birth rates. So there's a 30% error rate over this time frame if you go and look at their paper. So the number that you see there, whether you choose the 120 or the 104, is based on an algorithm of the by right population, which is the 15,270. So my point is whether you do nothing to the land use, you're going to see this population growth. We are visited by the sins of our fathers, another Monticello, and a bunch of other things. Okay? People are going to, that's what by right means. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and then afterwards we're very glad to hear other questions or field information requests separately. But do we have a final question? I don't see any hands up, I don't believe. So if not, that's great. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And were there any other items for discussion that from the working group? Mr. Polster.
not to belabor the point, but when we come to looking at the land use maps, and the point that I was ranting on about what we have for the by right of 15,279, you can look at the commercial figure, which is 3,797 acres. That's already cooked in. And to change any of that means a policy change for zoning. And so when we look at this map on there, it really deserves some conversations on why, for example, we've decided to keep the pottery section of the EO in the EO, or why we think we need mixed use at the Croker interchange, or why we think we want R5 density off of Old Town or all between Croker and Tohanna, you know, with the impacts that it has on traffic, environment, and the financial pieces. And so there are some, you know, as usual, the devil is in the details. And that kind of discussion, I'm really looking for. I mean, we have the issue of the Solera Woods, and I believe that Tim probably brought up the point about having something brought into the, that isn't in the PSA, but will get a well or a sewage. Is that something that we want to do? And it's those sort of land use things, plus what the staff has recommended, which I still haven't seen all of that, that I really am very interested in listening to how everybody feels about this, because we have a policy that says, guess what? We don't want growth outside of the PSA. And we have some notions about what we don't want in the residential area, but there's nothing to be suggested in any of the land use maps that I've seen outside of some policy implication at some time that is going to defer that outside of what? More density in mixed use that, by the way, is already there, except for the eastern state. No,
I think those are all good comments, and just to keep in mind that we will be working, you know, chapter by chapter in a sense, and so there's going to be land use issues that we can really dig deeper into and have some of these discussions for sure. But
Rich, I'm talking about the discussions before the map gets to the board on the 7th. And if those issues aren't hammered out in those two meetings, then there's going to be a lack of consensus when we get to that board meeting.
Well, what exactly is the, and I'll go to Tammy or Ellen, on the 7th, the board is going to receive what on that land use issue?
I think that's something we're still working out. We will, you know, have these documents ready for your next meeting, and then we'll consult with you from there.
Yeah. And I gather that what goes to the board on the 7th is still going to be fluid, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess that's where I was going, Frank, is that, you know, that there's some preliminary material, but certainly in 3 weeks, it's not going to be in concrete, but I think we need to have the discussions. And I know some of the other working group members have expressed an interest in getting a little deeper into the land use issues as well. Excuse me.
Rich, I agree. And if you agree with the idea that there's a gap analysis, and those are the things that the citizens are worried about, and we show them a land use map that does boo on any of those 5 issues, that's not responsive.
No, I hear what you're saying, and that's one of the reasons. A little earlier in the meeting, I said that we'll work to getting the initial discussion on the September 28th meeting and start working forward from that. Absolutely,
I appreciate that.
Sure. Anyone else? All righty. In that case, so is everybody fairly comfortable? I got a lot of positive feedback on the staff report on population and the research they did, and I think the consultants' information was a good summary, and obviously opened up some additional questions for further discussion. So. Any other comments on where we're going with this process? If not, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Alderman moves.
Thank you, Jack. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much.